A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper in which I attempted to conceptualize the Gothic in African folklore. Right about when I finished writing the introduction, I realized the incongruity of applying the Gothic literary construct to the African context. And I also realized that this was actually the lesser of the issues I had to contend with. The bigger issue was that there's just not enough separation between the things that characterize typically Western literary constructs like Gothicism, fantasy, or even mythology and folklore from African realities as depicted in oral traditions and literary works. And if you're African, you know exactly what I mean, because whatever the spiritual orientation, most Africans believe that the natural and supernatural realms overlap in tangible ways with direct implications for human beings. So one cannot just categorize an African novel which talks about spirits and mythical creatures as fantasy and what we now call mythology and folklore in their true essence are stories through which us African people have shaped and maintained and changed our lives and communities. This wasn't some groundbreaking conundrum I had run into, right? Because over the last decades, some very prominent voices in the African literary scene have wrestled with the question of how to label works of African literature which, true to the context out of which they come, weave in aspects of the supernatural in everyday life. And we've spent quite a bit of time this year talking about such works of African literature, and the plan is to do more of that this month and in the rest of the year. So I figured in this episode, we should take some time to reflect on how to contextualize these stories because, yes, it really does matter what we call them. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde.
I can best explain the difference between classic science fiction and Afrofuturism if I use the octopus analogy. Like humans, octopuses are some of the most intelligent creatures on Earth. However, octopus intelligence evolved from a different evolutionary line separate from that of human beings, so the foundation is different. The same can be said about the foundations of various forms of science fiction.
Nnedi Okorafor, who we just heard, is the Nigerian-American writer who in 2019 proposed the term Africanfuturism to describe literary works which draw from African oral traditions and often depict futuristic or otherwise technologically advanced worlds. And she also proposed the term Africanjujuism for literary works of a more fantastical nature, and we'll come to that later. Both Africanfuturism and Africanjujuism incorporate genres like horror and surrealism and science fiction and magical realism, with the distinguishing factor being that they emerge from African culture, history, mythology, and just a general African point of view, are written by and centered on people of African descent and are rooted in the African continent. Now, you may have heard the term Afrofuturism, and it's different from Africanfuturism. Afrofuturism is a term coined in 1993 by a collection of American writers in a paper. And these writers included Mark Derry, Tricia Rose, Greg Tate, and Samuel Delaney. And Afrofuturism describes the literary, cultural, artistic movement which brings together the African diaspora culture with science fiction and technology, and it tends to be very forward-looking, futuristic. Now, you might be wondering what the difference is between Africanfuturism and Afrofuturism, and the core of it is the source mythologies, right? Africanfuturism draws from African oral traditions and cultures which, despite being touched and changed by colonization and other global forces, retain, perhaps due to their proximity to the land and the people from which they arose, a fundamental quality of indigeneity. Now, Afrofuturism, on the other hand, draws from the culture of the African diaspora, which, while infused with African oral traditions, has also been touched and changed by the lands and the peoples it has traveled to and come in contact with. To borrow Nnedi Okorafor's analogy in the clip we listened to, if African futurism is an octopus genetically engineered by its environment and lifestyle to be alchemically mystical in its fierce intelligence and adaptability to change, Afrofuturism is another octopus forced to leave its natural saltwater habitat and live in brackish water. And brackish water is like salt water that has mixed with fresh water, so it has a little bit less salinity. And it knows it's not in its natural habitat, but it has enough of what's familiar and comfortable to keep it going. And it is fiercely intelligent and adaptable enough to figure out ways to thrive in the present environment and stay open to possibilities. So it's a mystical alchemist of a different caliber. African futurism caught on as a term to describe African literary works with that futuristic and science fiction undertone, but Africanjujuism, at least to my knowledge, didn't exactly stick the landing as a term to describe the fantasy aspect of African literary works. And it's important to remember that, in general, the fantasy genre does not necessarily look towards the future and usually does not have technology as a defining aspect of it. It more allows its eyes to follow the spiral of time and witness real or alternate timelines set in the past, in the present, or in the future. Now, in the double-visioned African context, what would be called fantasy is simply real life, infused with that crucial element of African indigeneity, which we talked about. Nnedi Okorafor, who coined the term, defines Africanjujuism as a subcategory of fantasy that respectfully acknowledges the seamless blend of true existing African spiritualities and cosmologies with the imaginative. And the word juju in the African context, particularly the West African context, generally refers to the supernatural and the mystical. So this is a kind of a perfect definition, in my opinion. It might be limited because juju is really a West African term, so not necessarily applicable to the rest of the African continent, but you get what I'm saying. Ironically, the word juju might be to blame for the term Africanjujuism not really catching on as it might have, because, you see, as pervasive as it is on the African continent, belief in the supernatural also involves a tendency to characterize any aspects which falls outside of the boundaries of prevailing religious and political norms as witchcraft or malevolent sorcery, to use a more specific term. And this attitude is an unfortunate artifact of colonial era machinations which cause indigenous African beliefs and worldviews, often the basis for rebellion and resistance, to be actively demonized, if not suppressed. This is where Afropantheology comes in. Afropantheology is a term proposed by Ogenechove Donald Ekpeki and Joshua Uchenna Omenga, both of whom are writers also from Nigeria. In the introduction to their book, Between Dystopias, The Road to Afropantheology, which was published last year in 2023, they articulate their vision for what this term encompasses, references, as Nnedi Okorafor does, the fact that the fantasy elements in African literary works are simply African spiritual realities. But in using pantheology, which the way I see it, the word just drapes over the genre like the quintessential sky-based African supreme being by whose will all things are created. They emphasize the connection between these spiritual realities and the gods, religions, and bodies of knowledge associated with them. And just as the sky sits above all of everything that's on this planet, Africans can take Afropantheology with us wherever we go. So African futurism, Africanjujuism, African pantheology, the way I see it, they all apply and they all point toward and validate the African viewpoint and frees us all from terms which, like Gothic, come close but do not quite touch the life center of what it means to be African. We'll be back next week with more explorations into the ever fertile world of African mythology and folklore. But in the meantime, check out the episode notes for more readings on these topics. And thank you, as always, for listening.